credentials basically don't mean anything at this point.
We can make the most perfect bodybuilder plan in the world, but if they hate it and they're just going to start program hopping every 2 weeks, I'd actually do if a strength program motivated them more to come in and do it for a year, then that's a better hypertrophy program, even though it's not a hypertrophy program, because they're just going to create some level of progression over time.
It's not always intuitive to fill in all the gaps or recognize where those gaps are. Probably wasting your time trying to do bottom only hip thrust when you could just do some split squats, lunges, or any other exercises.
And they're seeing more of these claims, like a Paul Palladino carnivore versus Lane Norton's randomized control trials, and everything that's in the middle. How do people start to learn who to put their trust in? So Cass, it's been far too long since we've had a proper catch up on here, and I've wanted to pick your brains on a few topics for a while, because when it comes to hypertrophy research, I think you're the person to go to. And there's a lot of things that are coming out as trends, fads, popular discussion points that I think a lot of people are a little bit lost on. So I wanted to have a conversation with you about what actually matters. So to start us off, the biggest thing that's come out of let's say the exercise science realm over the last few months is the topic of length and range being more hypertrophic. So what in this topic is legitimate, and what are people going overboard on?
I think the thing that's legitimate is that if we can find a way to get a lengthened bias, and I think that's something that's not totally understood, and you can say that that's a combination of training at a longer muscle length, but also making an exercise more challenging there. Seems to be somewhat beneficial for hypertrophy, and we don't have any instances where the opposite is better. Like, we don't have any instances where focusing on the short position is better. But the important context there is that isn't comparing just a one-to-one. So another important caveat is that we don't have comparisons for mixed data, meaning that just because in a one-to-one comparison that doing a set of a lengthened biased exercise is better for hypertrophy than a shortened biased exercise, one doesn't mean the shortened exercise isn't good or isn't effective, but also it doesn't tell us that only doing lengthened is the way to go. And in fact, the one piece or the one study that did do both a lengthened and a shortened, that mixed group actually outperformed the full range of motion group, which is kind of more ecologically valid to how a lot of people train for hypertrophy. They'll do some exercises that are, more lengthened biased, and then maybe they'll do some stuff that's emphasizing the short position. They'll kind of be trying to train through the range. And maybe the thing you can speculate from that is, instead of trying to make one exercise do everything and challenge the whole range of motion, that we do get benefit out of kind of exercises that have a peak to their resistance. So there's a particular part of them that are more challenging, and then choosing exercises that are challenging at different parts. But if we're purely looking at comparing one exercise to another, if all of the things were equal, stability, how specific they were, etc., if all of the other variables are consistent, then the one that's a little bit more lengthened bias has a higher probability of being more effective for hypertrophy. But that doesn't mean that it's 10 times more, or that the other one gives you 0. We're talking like, okay, cool, maybe this gives you 5%, 10%. Maybe, if we're talking about comparing the extremes of the least effective to the most effective, that's where it's like, yeah, okay, cool, maybe you could get something that's 50% more effective. But keep in mind that hypertrophy is also just a slow process in general. And these studies don't have a ton of people in them, and whatnot. So it's far from being a case where we know all the ins and outs and all the mechanisms. But we do know enough that it's like, hey, if you're not trying to challenge the lengthened position in a hypertrophy program, you might be leaving a few percentage points on the table in terms of how much you could be getting out on a per set basis. And that last part is important, that per set basis, because most people that have trained know that lengthened exercises maybe feel a little bit more fatiguing. Maybe they make you a little bit more sore, especially in the beginning. Now, it may be getting close to after 3 weeks, the repeated bout effect kind of washes that out. But a lot of people will have played around and understand that well, maybe I can tolerate a few more sets of an exercise that focuses on the short position.
Mm.
And so maybe it's like, well, okay, we're just talking about things that are created by sets. But if we're talking about just the overall amount of effort and fatigue I'm building up, maybe I could just simply make up for that inefficiency with a little bit more volume or training a little bit closer to relative failure on the short position versus the lengthened position. So it's important that we don't take this whole lengthen thing and put it on a pedestal as this is the only variable that matters, and we don't have to consider any of the other variables in exercise, and that it's a binary. If it's not lengthened, no gains, right? Like, so I think the thing that's the most blown out of proportion is kind of focusing on just the one thing and thinking that it's going to have way bigger of an impact than it may have.
It's the first time, I think, in a long time that I've remembered like a body of data making people convert the whole ethos around it. It's like you must have seen this when you were working in gyms with other trainers, right? That you'd always have that trainer that would go to a course and then everyone would be using Bulgarian clubs the day afterwards, like they changed the whole philosophy. And it feels a little bit like this, where they've thrown everything out in favor of only doing the length and range part. And is there an individual component to this, as you said there, with soreness and recovery? Like if someone's recovery capabilities aren't as good as, let's say, somebody else's, and obviously that's the argument there is, well, work on that first. But would that person maybe benefit from a little bit more shortened range work to create that stimulus, because it's slightly easier to recover from than doing 5 sets of RDLs as opposed to some sets of prone leg curls?
I can't say that it's better. I could, but what I can say is because you have options in terms of how much volume and how much relative effort that you train, that it's an option, meaning that you could have somebody that is just starting out in training. You could say, hey, we're going to focus a little bit more on short positions because maybe it'll be a little less soreness. Maybe it'll help you a little bit more with kind of like feeling the squeeze of the muscle and just kind of like help you learn like, whoa, well, that's what a bicep is. And that's what a lat is. And because short positions tend to be good for that. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, because you could just do lengthened stuff and maybe you don't go to the same degree of failure, or you don't do as many sets, and you manage it that way. I think the way to look at it is you have options, and understanding kind of how these variables interplay with each other allows you then to pick the appropriate lever, because a lot of times it's going to come down not to necessarily an individual perspective as much as it's combining that individual with whatever they have access to. Because let's say that, okay, the lengthened exercise that you have, it takes a lot of skill to develop. Okay. And then you have an exercise that, is in the short position that doesn't require any skill. So like a squat versus a leg extension. It's like, okay, cool. Well, you could, in this instance, be like, yeah, I'm going to purposely stay away from going to failure on the squat, knowing that there's a big skill component to this. And then when we get to the leg extension, I can just, push them very, very close to failure, knowing that this is going to be a little bit more short focused and stuff like that. I can still get output, so it's going to be likely, it's just like in a given scenario, what are the most, like, we'll say, what are the best levers to pull for this person? Should I have them push the set harder? Should I use more sets? Should I try and bias the portion of the exercise that's going to be a little bit more effective? And how does that play into what's the skill demand? What's the stability demand? How much absolute loading is in there? All sorts of different things. So you kind of have to know more, like, all of the variables before you can say that, like, oh, is longer or shorter better? And because it's never the only variable in an exercise for that person.
Yes. And I suppose then again, it depends on, as you start to get to know your client, which is when you, a lot of data is like, well, this is the bell curve of the population, but it doesn't mean this is what I'm going to be with Deborah or Steve or Bill. And like, if Bill's doing, let's say it's our hack squats, and I want more volume on his quads because we want to create more of an adaptation, a bit more of a progression, but his recovery starting to tap out, I could keep those hack squats or back squats in there and then add more volume through a leg extension to offset that recovery, but still create a little bit more of a stimulus, I suppose. So it's how, as you said, which lever to pull and when.
And specificity is a one that's kind of, I think specificity is the more complicated variable because it requires you to really understand the anatomy and biomechanics of an exercise. But like the simple ones for people to figure out are like, okay, if we're comparing squats and leg extensions are much better for the rectus femoris. So including both of those is kind of essential for training all of the quads. Because if you just do one or the other, like if you just do leg extensions, you're probably not adequately stimulating the shorter quads like the medialis and the lateralis as much. And you're focusing a little bit more on the rec fem, and then vice versa, right? And then same thing with everything else that you do in the upper body and whatnot, right? Like if you were to only do elbow flexion and never do any rowing motion or anything where you're kind of advantaging the shorter elbow flexors like the brachialis and the brachioradialis, it's like, okay, well, you can do all those curls, but you may never actually be making the shorter elbow flexors the limiter in the exercise. So they're kind of always being trained further away from failure than the other ones. So there's a lot to consider in terms of these variables. Glutes is a good example where we actually have good research on this as well. I think we have a push-pull study on everything now. Like triceps are better if you train in extensions and presses. Elbow flexors are okay, cool. Pull-ups are also good for elbow flexors. Why? Well, probably because the short elbow flexors have to work a lot more relative to the biceps because of the shoulder, right? We have the hamstrings comparing leg curls to squats to leg presses, showing that, hey, the compound motions are not good because you're doing kind of the opposite thing, right? So, all right, so we're going to need some sort of isolated hamstring work, right? And so I think, it's pretty safe to say like, okay, yeah, we were like doing this is good. And now in the glutes, we had that study comparing the squats to the hip thrust, and they had essentially the same growth, even though the squat, stretches the glutes more than a hip thrust, but the hip thrust is more specific. So not very many people, if they do a squat, they stop the squat and be like, yeah, I just couldn't get another rep because my glutes were toast. It's usually their quads or their low back. It's usually one of those two things is the limiter, or sometimes just the gas tank, right? Depending on the rep range they're working in, et cetera, right? So specificity is an important thing. So we can't just be like, okay, well, one's at a longer muscle length, therefore that one's always going to be better. If it's less specific, if it's less stable, if it has a higher skill or stability demand, et cetera, that like is going to make something else the failure point. All of those things can then override and be like, yeah, well, the muscle length doesn't matter, right?
So if we look at things like certain exercises are more specific at doing a certain thing, like the glutes being more specific, like what's your take on a lot of people coming out of this length and range stuff now of modifying short and range exercises to make them more length? For example, putting a pad on a prone leg curl to put an extra 2-3 degrees of length on the hamstrings. Like, is there logic to this? Or like in my head, it's like, well, if you wanted to have a length and range hamstring, do an RDL, do a hinge, do a seated leg curl if you want it to be stable. I don't think you're getting much more by adding extra hip flexion to a leg curl. But am I wrong in that thought process?
Well, in terms of the leg curl example, the challenge is we don't know if the benefit for training at longer muscle lengths increases the longer that you get, or if it drops off, or if it stays the same, or if it's just as long as it's, a certain degree of length, it's all the same after that. So it's hard to say how much an extra few degrees matters. Like, we just don't know. From what we do have, I can say that there's plenty of examples of showing the benefit way before we get to the longest possible muscle length, right? And that's coming from somebody that teaches people how to get to the longest possible muscle length, right? But we also teach how to get to the shortest possible muscle length too, so that we have this full spectrum in there, right? But I can't say, all right, well, look, if we're doing the leg curl there and you add those few extra degrees, how much of a difference does that make, if any, at that point in time? And then you could look at the context of, well, for the long hamstrings that attach to the hip, they're still not getting near as much of a stretch as if we could get the hip flexion in there. But for the short head of the biceps femoris, that's, maybe that extra 3 degrees is the difference between getting it to full length, right? And it's always, it's also going to come down to the machine, because some lying leg curls, they just stop early. So it's not necessarily like putting in the pad in there is doing an extreme stretch. It might just be that this machine already had like, a few inches of just like dead spot at the bottom to begin with, right? So in that instance, putting the pad in there might make a significantly different or significantly bigger difference versus if you already had a fairly good one, then maybe, you're really not changing anything at that point in time. So,
Mm.
it's hard to say. I try not to be overly judgy when people start modifying machines unless I know exactly the machine it is, because it could be like, yeah, okay, this is a leg curl where you get to 10 degrees of knee flexion before it actually starts lifting up the first plate, right?
Yes, and so I suppose it's, as you said there, it's depending on what's the goal of that modification. Is it to make a lying leg curl more of a length and range challenge, which may be like, well, there are better exercises to do that job. But as you said, if you're going a layer deeper and looking short head, of the bicep femoris, then it's like, well, actually, this is probably the way to get that at a particular length. It's like, is that the goal, or someone just modifying for the sake of modifying, which is maybe the bigger question.
And the opportunity cost is also, I mean, what's the hurt of like putting a pad down, right? I mean, it takes, a couple seconds or whatnot. So if the worst case scenario is like somebody feels a little bit more stretch, but and that's like, there we go. We get maybe just a little bit of placebo, effect from that, but it doesn't do any harm. I think in some of these instances, there's, very low risk of harm and very low, it doesn't take a lot of time or thought or whatnot. So it's like, okay, cool, try it and, see what happens, see if it works for you or not. Right. I mean, or even if you just like it better, cool, then that can be a thing. But then there are obviously other areas where it can make a big difference because we are making a significant change, where I think this, like the bad examples, or I would say like the kind of waste of your time examples, are things where when you take an exercise that is built for the short position and you have a perfectly good like alternative for the lengthened, and then you're trying like you're making like a 2 millimeter modification rather than doing that. So if you were doing this modification to the lying leg curl and 6 feet from you was the seated leg curl, you should probably just go use the seated leg curl, unless we're talking about the example where the machine itself just, has kind of like a dead spot in it, right? And then in which case I would recommend doing that. For instance, my lying leg curl, I actually added an additional setting so that there's tension right from the bottom, right?
Okay.
Not because I think that's going to 10x the hypertrophy, but I just want to have tension through the whole range that machine offers me.
Yeah.
Right? But something like for instance, the hip thrust, and trying to do like lengthen partials in a hip thrust, when it's like you could just stand up and do a split squat or a lunge or a leg press or like any of those other things would in that instance be better options, right? So sometimes we have an exercise where this is really built and really effective for training the short range, and if you try and do like a lengthened partial of that, you're taking away the quality that exercise had and trying to make it something that it's not, right? So you're probably wasting your time trying to do bottom only hip thrust when you could just do some split squats, lunges, or any other exercise that's going to get you not only to a longer muscle length but have a better loading pattern, and probably also be a little less awkward because the hip thrust is already a small movement. So it's like you're doing a partial of a short partial at that. So you're doing a lengthened partial of a short partial at that point in time, right? And you could kind of say that about the lying leg curl too, but the caveat there is that, well, nobody has, a hip thrust it's just a barbell hip thrust is a barbell hip thrust. You're never going to have one where the range of motion is limited or something like that. It's, but you might have a crappy leg curl.
Yes. You mentioned there, like, of adjusting your leg curl to get as much tension to the range that you have. Now, one of the first things that I saw when the initial research started coming out about the length and range stuff, it was the rise up of the disgruntled meathead, where we had all the people that maybe have done exercise mechanics courses like RTS or like your course, but we're 2-3 rungs down in terms of Chinese whispers, and we got people that never train hard putting more bands than a sex swing on a Smith machine. And then we had all these people going, right, look, length and range is the thing. We don't need any of these bands anymore. We want to load this portion only, right? And I'm like, there's normally truth at both extremes, and there's the answers generally in the middle. So are we still looking, or are coaches, if they're for their own training, whether they want to nerd out, is there still benefit of trying to match resistance and strength profiles, or should we now bias just maximally low in the length and position and not even worry about, let's say, the top of a press? Where is that nuance?
I have, for hypertrophy, I have kind of been focusing on breaking up the resistance challenge across exercises for about a decade now, and have found that preferable. And where I used to lean on kind of, all right, if, when do we want a full range challenge? It would be like, okay, I'm only I'm limited to just one exercise, so it's a time or set efficiency thing of like, hey, I just need to get as much there. Or there's a strength perspective, because strength is more range of motion specific, right? Whereas hypertrophy maybe is not. Okay. And there's still a lot to eke out there, right? I mean, there's plenty of, we'll say, critiques of the current literature we have, one being, well, okay, what about after people have been doing lengthened exercises for, a long period of time in trained subjects? Is it still beneficial, or does it eventually wash out, and whatnot? And, while there's no evidence to say that is true, which a lot of people on the opposite side are speaking like there is actual evidence, the reality is there just isn't evidence yet, right? So it's in case of like, we don't know, there's no evidence. So you're just, on both sides, we're just guessing, but there's nothing for sure to say that does, that it does wear off at this point in time, right? And we don't understand the mechanisms well enough to strongly speculate that either. That's another area where people are very strongly, like, they're acting like, I think right now we're in a state in the industry where everybody wants to take the position that everything's all figured out, and that's just not the reality. But because of the way they do their content, they have to take a really strong view on things and present things and maybe cherry pick and take things out of context to present the information as if, yeah, I have all of the answers for you right here. But I think as coaches, it's actually, like, right now is a nice place to be if you can kind of understand the principles, because you understand, hey, I have options with my client, right? I can tailor these variables, and I have more than one way to kind of get towards the results. But reeling back to the question, is there any place to do a full range challenge? In hypertrophy, I don't think it's at all a need. And I think that if we take the data as we have it right now and we apply that to this question, it would appear that having that challenge in the short position could be holding us back a little bit, because essentially we're getting a little bit, we're exchanging some fatigue to finish working hard in that short position, and that's likely costing us a little bit of volume of exposure in the lengthened position. So one possible mechanism for lengthened partials is simply just because you can get a few more repetitions in the lengthened position by not having the fatigue that you get from going through the short position. That may be the only mechanism that matters in this case. Is it's simply just a shift of volume load at, a given length. So if it's like, all right, if this portion of the range is slightly more stimulatory, and then I just save the energy cost of the short position so that I can get a little bit more in the lengthened, all we're seeing is that, hey, it's that volume difference in the lengthened position. That's the effect of the lengthened partial. That
And
could be
do we see that research in exercises that maybe favor people failing in the shortened position? Say, for example, like a press, right, where the load is going to be in that lengthened position. I always look at this length and range partial research and think, well, is it actually the length and range stuff that made the difference, or is it taking that muscle closer to failure that made the difference by doing the length and range partial in the first place? If that makes sense.
So one thing that's missing right now from the lengthened research is exercises where there is a significant drop off or a stack in the short position, right? So for instance, we don't have a bottom only versus full range of motion squat study.
Hmm.
We have basically a short range and a full range, right? Those are the comparisons that we have. And the majority of the partial data is done on like single joint, like it's elbow flexion extension, knee flexion, knee extension. So in a leg, they don't give us a lot of detail on like the resistance curve of the machines being used, but I'm assuming that they're not using a leg extension that drops off to nothing at the top, or a
And
leg
are they
curl that
using,
drops off
sorry
to
to cut
nothing.
you off there, Cass, but are they using machines because they're easier to control? Like the skill component of a squat could be the thing that's limiting the study, so they choose a leg extension or elbow flexion extension because it's easier to
Yeah,
manage.
there's just so many more things that are easy to standardize, right?
Yeah.
Everything from like range of motion to loading, etc., stability, skills, like all of those things. So a lot of times you're going to see like the initial research is going to focus on the simplest possible methodology, which may not be extremely ecologically valid, but it at least gives us a proof of concept before then we start to apply it to more complex scenarios where there would be potentially more confounders, like, all right, the skill component, the anthropomorphics, etc., right?
Yeah.
But like femur length doesn't matter in the leg extension,
Yeah.
right? So that's, or ankle mobility, etc. Like, so it's really valuable to be able to start with simple things where you can be a little bit more certain of cause and effect. But when we want to know, like, okay, real world, how's this going to play out? And we also need to know, like, all right, what about exercises that have very different qualities, like a dumbbell press, for example, or an RDL, or any of these exercises where the short position already is kind of it drops off to the point where it wouldn't be very fatiguing to perform anyway. In those instances, are those exercises already lengthened, biased enough?
Hmm.
And my guess is going to be in some cases, yes. And what we have done at N1 is we have done a lot of testing using volume load and looking at changes in relative exposure using different training methods for different types of exercises. So taking the dumbbell press and comparing how many repetitions you can get doing partials only, or doing integrated partials, or doing the full range of motion, and actually looking and seeing how the technique changes how much lengthened exposure you get. And in some of these exercises that are already lengthened biased, you get no additional lengthened exposure because the short position that you're cutting off was already almost like nearly a rest position anyway. And then there are instances where you actually get less volume by doing the partial, because the partial imposes another limiter, maybe like a respiratory limiter. Like for me in an RDL, to not stand up and have that like second to rest and breathe drastically decreases my performance, right? And you'll see that in squats and stuff. So especially a lot of like big compound and things like that, like leg presses, for example. Like if I do partial only leg presses, the amount of volume load that I can get versus doing full range of motion or something like integrated partials is significantly less. And
Yeah.
I don't think that anybody can come up with a mechanism where, if by doing the partials you actually did less load and less reps, that it would somehow magically be more hypertrophic. I don't think there's any way that you can kind of come up with a mechanism or logic for that. You would have to say that the short position actually is anti-hypertrophy at that point. And we know that not to be true, because short position exercises still do produce hypertrophy, just a few percentage points below on a per set basis,
Hmm.
right? So the right now, I think people are jumping on the bandwagon and they're just being like, oh yeah, just lengthen partial everything, right? Doesn't matter what it is, and just blindly applying that. And in reality, it should be like looking at an exercise and deciding that, okay, is this an exercise where if I incorporate one of these lengthen partial techniques, is it going to increase the performance or the amount of exposure I get in that lengthened position? And then it might be worth it. But the other caveat is doing lengthen partials here a better option than simply just doing exercise option B that is already lengthened biased itself? So for instance, take example, somebody's got a 45-degree hip extension. Okay, if you do just the bottom, you will increase the performance there. But you probably just be better off just standing up and doing the RDLs, right? Like if we're just comparing that, right? Now, again, this is where it's like, but that's not the only thing that matters. Maybe somebody's technique and their ability to stabilize and all that stuff. Maybe the 45 is a better place for them to learn to hinge and to practice that now. And then cool, yeah, you could do like the partials in the 45 there, and then work towards being able to do RDLs.
And maybe where they're at the workout, right? I suppose like doing an RDL, doing more sets of RDL is probably going to be mentally more fatiguing, to the point, like your example of like not being able to stand up and take the breather, shifts load. That incline hyper, if you wanted to add more sets of glute work or hamstring work at the end of a workout, adding that extra stability means you don't have to think about as much, means they can take things close to failure and work harder, has a bigger benefit than doing more the length and range in that instance.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So exactly. That's why you can't just look at one variable and then make all of your exercise selection decisions off of just that one thing. It should always be what is the net, and which of these levers is the most appropriate to pull for this client at this time, both like within the program, within their workout, et cetera. Right.
You've
Also,
mentioned,
if you train in a real gym, sometimes it's just like, hey, the thing that I wanted to is unavailable. I can get this is the closest thing, and we can rig it up over here, and all we can do is just manipulate, tempo or whatever, and then cool, we're still getting somewhat of the effect that I wanted to, even though it's not the most ideal option. It's the optimal one right now, because the alternative is we sit around with our thumb in our butt for 5 minutes while we wait for the other person to use the machine.
Do you think the practicalities, things that coaches aren't focusing on, like in that sense, obviously what's available at the gym is one component of this, but also enjoyment? You mentioned how hypertrophy takes a long time, and we can sit there and optimize a program out the yazoo. But if we've got so many bands and manipulations where the client is overwhelmed going into the gym, or if we just don't enjoy that session, like I find that most coaches who deal with Gen Pop, we can make the most perfect bodybuilder plan in the world, but if they hate it and they're just going to start program hopping every 2 weeks, I'd actually do if a strength program motivated them more to come in and do it for a year, then that's a better hypertrophy program, even though it's not a hypertrophy program, because they're just going to create some level of progression over time. Do we think there needs to be more focus from coaches on, well, who is the person in front of me, and do they enjoy something, even if it's not quote unquote ideal?
Yeah. So when you're working with real people, you have to do what I basically like phrase as, you have to match the physiology to the psychology, which means that your goal is to find the best physiological stimulus that's going to work towards their goal, but fits within the or the psychological parameters in terms of what they're actually willing to do, and will be consistent with and be able to apply effort to and whatnot, right? So you don't necessarily have to pick people's favorite things, especially if they're focused on their goals, right? But you definitely don't want to pick a bunch of things that they're just absolutely going to hate and not stick with, right? And you can find a balance, because occasionally you can throw things in there where like, oh yeah, cool, maybe this is a few percentage points less effective, right? But if I get out of just the physiology mode and understand that, like, by doing this, it provides a huge uplift in this person's mood, their motivation, and how hard they want to push and train, et cetera, then cool. That's going to be potentially a larger net positive than something that's better physiologically on paper. And I think right now we've like the evidence-based push in the coaching space has kind of made it so that like people can't have opinions and preferences anymore, or if they do, they just can't speak about them publicly. They can't admit that they like chose a different exercise. One of my favorite examples is when I first started doing the just like the single arm pull down things and posting those on social, right before everybody else started doing it, people would like they would get at me if I did it in a different machine or a different space, and be like, oh, is this one better than the last one? I'm like, no, literally somebody was using that machine. So I walked over and I used the other machine where I could do essentially the same motion That's it. Why are you doing this one? Because that's the one that I could use. It's that simple. There's not a lot of thought to it, right? Like this one was open. Why aren't you using the prime functional trainer today? Because somebody else was, and the life fitness one was available, right? It was like, oh, I using this. Why are you using the hammer machine instead of the, well, because this is the one that was available. So not only is there the preference thing, but there's also just like, people working in the real world, like those are just decisions that you're going to have to make for, in some situations, right? And then you have like so many more people training at home now.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, cool. Right now, part of it is like, how can we come up with this scenario of exercises where, you don't have to play Bob the Builder for half the workout with your rack. Just like, it's like, okay, is it worth the setup time here? Or should we just do the dumbbell laterals because we can just grab the dumbbells and do the dumbbell laterals. Right.
Yes.
Did
you see Mike Isotol recently on Modern Wisdom, Chris Williamson's podcast?
I have not listened to that yet.
So he does this thing when he gets anyone from the fitness space on, and he asks them if they only had 10 exercises for the whole rest of their life, what would they choose? And I thought it was a breath of fresh air with Mike, because a lot of his exercise, he went, and what's the reason behind that? And he goes, manhood. And I was like, there's just this element of like, he enjoys it. And if he's got 10 exercises that he wants to progress long term, it might not be the most perfect exercise, but he's going to want to squat because he's built to squat and he enjoys squatting. And I think that's something that we forget is like, I went to Muscle Nerd seminar recently. I was talking about proximity to failure with Luke at the front of the room. And he was like, well, Chinese weightlifters don't go that far to failure. Are you going to tell them they're small? And I'm just like, and I'm like, well, there's so many ways to get to the same end goal that, yes, some might be more quote unquote dialed in and more optimal if you're trying to control all the variables. But at the end of the day, it's consistency and progression over the long term that's going to trump any of this fine tuning. Like you said it yourself, it's like you can't optimize a workout you're not doing.
I think it's very easy to take the stance that, well, this stuff doesn't matter, and just strongman consistency and effort over time. But understand that if these things matter a little bit, well, the more consistency and effort that you put in, the more they will matter over time, right? I think what people really need to take away from these conversations is you just need to be clear what your priorities are. That's really all it is, right? Like if your priority is to eke out every percentage of hypertrophy that you could possibly get, then you're going to want to pursue all of these things, right? If it's that important. But if it's simply not worth the effort or time or thought to you, there's nothing wrong with that. Do what fits within your realm of priority. It's that simple, right? People that train 4 times a week, that's worth it to them, right? People that only train 3 times a week, it's probably not because they're like, yeah, I could train 4 times a week, but it's only like 12% more. Like that's probably not the decision they made. They probably made the decision of like, hey, that extra hour in the gym, like I would rather have that extra hour, with my family, or, like that is the decision. It's just simply managing priorities, right? And I think that we've gotten in a place where, the human element is left out of this so much that everybody wants like, here's the for sure like answer, and you have to do it this way. And then the pushback to that is none of that fucking shit matters. Just do the thing. And neither of those are like the best approach, right? Because you shouldn't just, if you're gonna apply tons of time and effort to something, then you probably should put a little bit more thought into it, right?
Yeah.
And also at the other end of the spectrum, like, man, if you only have a certain amount of time, but you really do care about the results, you're just not going to, leave your family to do it. Well, you better make sure that the time you have is very well spent and efficient. So the people where it's like, this doesn't matter are the people that have plenty of time, but just don't care that much, and that is fine. I think everybody is in this stage where it's like, look, if you're going to train, you have to care about everything. It's like, no, some people just like going to the gym, so for some, like, there are tons and tons of gyms that have people where it's like, that is their social life or whatever, right? It's like they look the same every year or whatnot. And you could argue like, oh man, if they would do this, it'd have better results. Yeah, but maybe they just really don't care. Maybe what's more important for them is that when they're at the gym, they can talk to that person that they've known for 30 years, in between sets, and what, like that is the experience that they're going for. They're not going there for like, man, my arms could have been half an inch bigger by now if I would have just, not gabbity gabbed, and like, okay, for one person it's this way, for another person it's that way. Like these are human beings at the end of the day. It's not like everybody that goes in the gym is an aspiring IFBB pro, and we need to critique their approach as if, they left results on the table today because there were 2 reps in reserve here, or whatever it was.
And it's knowing that where your principle, like you said earlier on about this is a good time in the industry for a coach to understand principles. And I think this is the key thing of like knowing that everyone's life goes through phases and periods in life. Like my last 8-9 months of training, it's been a real like soul searching learning curve where I gone into my 30s, and while I still love bodybuilding and hypertrophy, like me looking shredded like I did at 26, like would I like to be? Sure. Does it matter to me as I did 10 years ago? No. So I left Hong Kong and I was like, right, I'm gonna do some powerlifting stuff. I'm gonna get stronger. I'm gonna really focus on that because it's a little bit of a different stimulus. And then I realized, well, now I've just started a business, and now I'm spending 4 hours of workout in the blooming gym trying to do tons of sets and tons of load and loads of big long rest periods. And I've sort of gone full circle back into almost a closer to Mike Mensa, Arthur Jones style high intensity bodybuilding route, because it's like, well, now I go, well, I can either do more work or less of it, but more intense work. And I'm leaning into that intensity so I can spend more time on building the business and spend more time with my new wife and my family I haven't seen in 4 years properly. So I'm now pulling a few more of these levers when it comes to trying to make my exercise selection intensity as optimal as I can do, because I'm at this phase of life not wanting to do more of it as much. But in 6 months or a year, when maybe things have settled down, the business is in a good place, I might dial the frequency lever up. And then a few things might not matter as much as they did right now. And I think coaches don't spend that enough time trying to understand that. Like, do you think when it comes to coaches' education these days, coaches should be now looking to understand the principles more than they wanting to put evidence-based on their Instagram handle?
Well, if you don't understand the principles, you aren't evidence-based. We'll just put it that way. Whether you put it in there or not, I would say the majority of people, and I'm comfortable saying the majority of the people that are using evidence-based or science-based, it's a marketing clout thing. And the majority of the messaging and content that they're putting out is not evidence or science-based in totality, even though there may be like, cool, they throw up a PubMed ID here, or they're like, well, I'm doing this because this thing, like take the long muscle length, right? Like there's, I've seen tons of people like, oh, this is a science-based workout. And the only thing it is like, okay, now we're just ranking things or just doing things on how long the muscle length. I'm like, that's, science doesn't say that this is now the only thing that matters, right? At all. So that's not an evidence, like that's an evidence limited approach, not a evidence-based approach, if in my opinion. So you need understanding the principles is essential for navigating the evidence and then actually applying that evidence, because the lab is a different context than the real world gym environment. And you need principles to carry the evidence that we gain from scientific research into working with humans in the real world. It's that simple, right? So I like actually, and I just had a podcast with Eric Helms, and we were continuing on this like science versus anti-science kind of thing that's going on. And this is kind of like one of the things that we were getting into, was this whole thing of like, well, is what's being portrayed as science, or the expectation of science, realistic? Because a lot of people are looking at, well, science is going to give me the absolute answer, and I'm like, not in this field, not on these questions, right? It can't. What it can do is it can kind of like maybe give us some starting points or some guesses and whatnot. But the majority of the decisions that we're making as coaches are based off of very foundational sciences like anatomy and biomechanics and physics. And then we're taking kind of like the more the applied sciences, like, the volume research and train to failure research. And we're kind of using that to kind of navigate like how to start and like where to adjust and stuff like that. But we have to have those principles. Like if you don't understand the principles between how volume and intensity relate to each other, well, you can't apply either of those bodies of evidence. Like same thing with like, oh, how does rest interval affect those things, right? So it's like, well, yeah, cool. Like I can do a ton of sets if I don't take much rest in between, because those sets drop and drop and drop and drop in performance, right? But you can't do the same number of sets with a 4 or 5 minute rest. Like you'll just be absolutely crushed and annihilated, right? But we we've had similar people in our circles and done similar training methods. You've done probably the Vince Durandas, the IRMs, or the 6-12-25s or whatever, and like all these extremely dense methods. If you pulled those apart and you took long rests in between there, as brutal as those protocols are, they would be far worse, like, because it would be so much more volume, right? So you have to understand principles to apply any of this stuff from the evidence, unless the way that you're going to train people is just literally replicate a study. And that's not, because those studies don't tell us the best way. They say like, okay, the people that did this way, here's how their results compared to the people that did the other way. That doesn't mean that the one that was the best is the best. It just means it was in one way or another, or a certain margin, better than the other way, right? So if we have a study comparing two exercises, the winner is not by default the best exercise. That's not what the evidence says. It just says that exercise happened to be better than this exercise for this specific group of people doing it this way for this amount of time.
And it's knowing what's statistically relevant, right? I think like evidence informed was the term that Luke Lehman obviously talked about a lot. And I think this is a great way of thinking about it. Like if we look at something for sake of argument, like fasted cardio. Fasted cardio, if we look from a principle perspective, there is logic we can make a pathway where that makes sense. But on the flip side of that, is it statistically relevant? That it makes actually that much a big of an impact? For the most part, no. Now, there might be a circumstance where you're trying to get the last 0.5% of body fat of someone before a show where you might pull that lever. But for the gen pop that wants to lose 5 pounds, it probably doesn't make a much of a difference. It doesn't make it wrong. And when you see people that understand principles, they are often the least sure people, because it's like, well, I can't say that for certain. It is just, this gives me information to go, right, what is more likely going to be a good lever to push and what's more likely not going to be a good lever to push, rather than giving me a definitive answer of, as you said, best.
Let me ask you a question. Think of like the first 5 things that you do every day.
Okay.
How consistent are you with those 5 things?
Probably not as much as I'd like to be. I grab a coffee. I'm always consistent of that. And then I have a shower. And other than that, the other 3 things will change every day.
I mean, but you use the toilet, you brush your teeth.
Yeah, if I broke it down that much, probably so, yeah.
Now, compare the things that you do at the beginning to the consistency of the 10th or 20th thing that you do throughout the day. How much does the consistency drop off?
Hugely.
Huge amount, right? So this is where, like, okay, if we're comparing fasted cardio to non-fasted cardio, in the constraints of research, which means basically people have to be in the same relative calorie deficit with the exact same consistency in everything. But in the real world, is it too hard to imagine that, well, if fasted cardio is part of somebody's routine that they're going to basically now do like at the very beginning of their day, and they're doing it like as a prelude to when they're going to have their meal and all this other stuff, is it possible that one of the signals for why in the real world people are like, yeah, this seems to work better, is all consistency? Right?
Yeah.
Like if we could do an ecological study and look at, hey, people that do fasted cardio versus people that do cardio after work, right? And figure out, all right, what's the relative consistency? If the plan was X amount of times per week, who is doing a better job of actually of hitting those? And I would venture to say that probably the people that do that fasted cardio probably are on average just more consistent with it, right? And maybe they're in a better headspace when they do it, etc. Right? Now, this isn't I'm being like, hey, everybody should do fasted cardio. I'm just saying we have to be careful with saying that because there wasn't a difference in the research doesn't mean it would, like, things like that won't have a difference in the real world because of non-physiological factors.
Well,
Right.
if you on and adding on to that as well, right? Like that person that does fasted cardio, like I've always liked the idea if I'm trying to build an aerobic base for someone early on, they're doing 3 days a week of doing some form of cardio every single rest day. Now, is it absolutely necessary? No, but why I do it is if I've got a day where I'm doing nothing, I'm sitting on the sofa watching Netflix, I'm more likely to grab a bag of Doritos on that day. Whereas if I got up in the morning and did some cardio, the chances of me falling into a bag of Doritos is less because I go, oh, well, I don't want to ruin that workout or I don't want to ruin that piece of cardio. Where if you compare that to the person who's got the cardio at the end of the day, which may or may not do it, but it's constantly playing on their mind, I need to do the cardio, I need to do the cardio, I need to do the cardio. Now, we can argue of how much stress and the adrenals impacts body composition, but I tell you what, the person that's ticked off something for their day and feels pretty good about themselves the rest of the day is in a better headspace is going to have a different impact on all these things from nutrition choices to how they feel compared to that person where it's just weighing on their head all day.
Yep. This is why we can't look at research as real world stuff all the time. If we can eke out things that do have a physiological difference, that's awesome, and we can bake that into what we do. But we also have to look at the things that just affect, behaviors and logistics, and something like meal frequency. What's the evidence on meal frequency? It used to be like, oh, this, and then now it's this. Now it doesn't matter. And reality is like, I bet if you if you did some experiments with people, you'd find that, hey, either eating fewer or more meals is going to have an impact on their appetite, right? And for some person, it's going to impact their convenience, and it's going to impact how likely they are to actually, prep their meals or cook their meals versus, getting meals, So when we're talking about having an impact, okay, a lot of times the physiological impact that we're going to have on people as coaches comes from things that are going to impact convenience, logistics, behavioral stuff, motivation, consistency, all of those things. And they're not only going to be like, hey, if this person was a robot and they had option A or B, A is going to have this physiological and B is going to have this. It's like, hey, if I do A, B, and C, what it's going to do is it's going to affect D, and D is actually the thing that has the physiological outcome, right?
So, like on that topic of sort of like research, I do an episode every week. I do a recording with my mate, and we it's more the light-hearted, put a slightly our tinfoil hats on, and we just chat lad banter about the fitness industry. And we did an episode about the 2024 predictions, and one of mine was that the term fitness misinformation and conspiracy theory would become the hot topic this year. And so far, I have proven to be right. Right. So with this sort of topic, right, it's getting banned about more and more and more. Now we know some things are genuine BS, while others things people slam purely because they don't truly understand something, and it's easier to criticize than it is to say that this has an impact. So if there's a newer coach listening to this and they're seeing more of these claims, like a Paul Saladino carnivore versus Lane Norton's randomized control trials, like, and everything that's in the middle, how do people start to learn who to put their trust in? Other than obviously N1, which is the easy answer.
Yeah. I've had this conversation with a lot of smart people, and I don't think anybody has a good answer, because credentials basically don't mean anything at this point. Experience may or may not mean something. A person's physique may or may not mean something. I mean, if they're even a real person here, in a couple of years you won't even know, right? With AI. So it is an extremely difficult landscape to navigate. The best answer, which is the most inconvenient answer, is well, you need to do your own research and learn enough about these topics. So by the time you become the expert, then you'll know who the experts are. But that obviously is not helpful, because most people, they're looking to the experts to save them the work of having to become the expert themselves. And unfortunately, just with human nature and, algorithms, etc., we're not in a spot where it's very easy to navigate that space, or you can be extremely confident in that space. So looking at everything with a healthy degree of skepticism, but also then not dismissing anything as well is probably I see like the Paul Saladino thing, like his name has been thrown out, on a lot of the stuff, right? But does that mean that everything that he said is false? No. And does that mean that there aren't, loads and loads of people that have, tried carnivore and had fantastic results, right? So it's this kind of ties on to the conversation that we were just having is like, well, A, B, and C may affect D, and I mean, full disclosure, like I've been on a like modified carnivore-ish diet for like 2 years, not necessarily for a body comp diet by any means. I'm eating plenty of calories, but yeah, I feel better. My digestion's better. My skin's better. Those type of things, right? Am I still making sure I'm getting all my micronutrients and stuff in there? Am I having zero carbs? No, but like the carbohydrates that I have are low residue or whatever. So my diet would be
like carnivore adjacent.
Low. Yeah, I mean, so it's like I have starches and fruit, but I don't have a lot of like superfoods are not a thing that exists, in my diet per se, right? And I don't like, and to nutrition is going to be a very individual thing, but you can look at all the different diets and you can figure out, okay, is there a reason that a person would or wouldn't have had success on a particular one, and how much of that had to do with the actual macronutrient makeup of the diet versus the logistical ease of the diet. Like the most strict diets also remove the most decision making. So for certain people, those diets are significantly more successful because for those people, not having to make the decisions is actually what makes them successful in the diet. So that's where it's like single macronutrient or single food diets are tremendously good ways to get somebody that just like, I can't make a decision on any of these things. That's a good way to get them started and then slowly increasing the flexibility in there. But if you just say like, hey, you just need to, eat whatever you want and just be under these calories, that's a million decisions a day if you don't put any constraints on it. And certain individuals will just absolutely hate that, right? And on the opposite side of the spectrum, some people will hate being restricted that much, right? So when it comes to this stuff, I think a lot of it is a lot of it isn't that like, hey, this particular approach is not useful for anybody. It's that when we get into the claims of how it works, why it works and whatnot, that a lot of times the unknown gets filled in with just, bias or opinion, or there's just such little interest in the nuance, right, that it's very easy to be like, well, this doesn't work because of this one thing, without considering all of the different factors that it could have an impact on, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like if you are a new coach or whatnot, sticking to the foundational sciences is going to be really good, and understanding that when it starts getting into the nuances, likely you have a lot of options and you need to be considering outside of just like the just the science or just the evidence or whatnot, and looking at like, try and put yourself in a person's shoe and figure out, okay, if I plug in this variable, what are all the ways that it impacts this person? Is that a net positive or a net negative?
I think it's a very good way of saying it, and I'm so glad you spoke about the decision fatigue element in this, because there's so many coaches that just give macros, and just like it's like saying to somebody who wants to learn Mandarin, rather than getting a Rosetta Stone tape, show my age with tapes, but let's just drop you in Beijing and hope you work it out. I was like, it's so much stuff to think about, and I think I almost want to bring up that topic for the argument of that. There's the most of the time we have a negativity bias, right? Rather than going, someone says seed oils are bad for you, and that's a negative bias, and then people go, well, no, it's not. You're wrong. Whereas, well, let's look at what's good. So before we slam the carnivore diet for what it's lacking, how about we look at the fact that organ meat is super healthy? And if you've got a client that doesn't like vegetables but likes a bit of liver, then they have a bit of options for them. We can add in some more red meat, some more oily fish, some more eggs, and plug some of those holes. Seed oils may not be bad for the metabolically healthy 25-year-old who's taking part in these nutrition studies, but also at the same time, we have a situation where our omega-6 to omega-3 ratios in the West are all over the shop. So again, one person's is something as ever someone completely fine with is another person's poison. And it's like, if you, again, comes back to that point, if you understand the principles, you can go, well, where is Paul Saladino right? And where is Lane Norton right? Because they both can be right.
Yeah. And, nobody's expert should trump your client's bowels. Right. So when it comes to like, oh, there's nothing wrong with artificial sweeteners. I'm like, well, every time this person has this, they're running to the toilet. I'm like, well, there's your N of 1 study right there. Right now, like, you may not know why or whatever. Maybe it's like, I mean, like, I get all the time, like, people are like, oh, what's the best carbs? I'm like, whatever you digest the best, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, if white rice makes you feel good and brown rice makes you feel like bloated or whatever, eat white rice. Like, that's, like, it's, there's so many, I mean, there's such a desire to have an absolute answer to apply to everybody now, that people are missing the personal part of personal training or coaching or nutrition, and understanding that, like, hey, your job is to solve problems. And a lot of times knowing all the science is good to have in the background to solve those problems. But where you're actually going to get the best solutions is asking your client, questions, and then tracking and monitoring what's actually going on with them and applying that science to them.
Yeah.
Right.
I try and take the negativity out of anything I do now. When we talk about, like, is someone going to have a higher carb, lower fat, or a higher fat, lower carb diet? If you put aside the obvious preference group, which is obviously the biggest component here, there was that more like, rather than looking at a high fat diet as carbs are bad, I look at it as like, well, I just have more room for fats. And fats could be really good if I want to address this omega 6:3 ratio, or I could fuel carbs, which are protein sparing. And like, it's not fats are bad or carbs are bad. It's that carbs are good or fats are good. And not having this judgmental attitude. I think no one questions someone with a nut allergy who goes, hey, I go into anaphylactic shock when I have these nuts, and goes, well, shut up, they're healthy, eat them. But we see this with seed oils and pesticides, that someone doesn't agree with them and we tell them they're an idiot and they're wrong. Like, people slamming Michaela Peterson, who's had all sorts of issues before going carnivore. Now, does that mean she should be carnivore for life? Does that mean there may not be better options? Maybe. But are you telling me that her experience is invalidated and she's gone from hip replacements and acne and depression to feeling great? I'm like, there's a net positive here. Like, let's not slam her experience.
Yeah. Again, I think it's one of those things where we want to pretend we know all the ins and outs without. They test a limited amount of things when it comes to these nutritional studies, right? So it's very, very, like, just accept that we are a lot more ignorant to cause and effect than we would like to admit, as a species, as an industry, etc. Right. And you don't want to abuse anecdote, but you don't want to ignore it either. You want to have that balance of both, right? That's without blowing into a whole different tangent. Like, just balance is the key there, as it is with many things.
I think that brings us on to my general closing question, which I didn't even have in this podcast when I had you on last time, and I think this would be a really interesting one. So, what is one thing that you have changed your mind on? This can be nutrition, this could be training, this could be life. What is one thing that you used to believe that you don't anymore?
This is becoming like the cliche question now, I feel like, on all of these things.
I'm hoping I came up with it first. I tried to do one I hadn't heard yet, but I probably didn't. I almost certainly didn't.
I mean, depending on how far back you go, there's there's a variety of things. Like, most recently, it's like whether I'm white pilled or black pilled on the fitness space. Like, I think towards like last year, I was kind of white pilled. I'm like, okay, I think we're gonna start seeing a push for nuance and the proper use of science and evidence base. And now I'm black pilled on that. But in terms of like something I'm applying, I mean, we're constantly changing. Or I shouldn't say changing, but we're constantly evolving. And so most of the things that I change are not like radical changes. If anything, they're slight nudges in one direction or the other. And I think that's what most people like. If a new study comes out, you shouldn't radically change what you're doing, right, by any means, because the power of one study is very, very small, and there's always limitations, etc., right? So odds are, if you've been getting results, that doesn't mean you shouldn't probably just like, oh well, here's a new study, I guess I should completely change my approach. But the like for something we've done in house, our say lat stuff, we have kind of looked at the lat as more of a primary mover of the scapulothoracic joint or the sternoclavicular joint, right? So the elevation, depression, protraction, retraction as a primary function, and shoulder extension, adduction as a secondary function. And it may like these things are always so funny because like once you kind of figure them out, you're like, oh, why did it take so long? Why was this not like clearly obvious before? And a big part of it is there are so like I've realized how many biases I have simply based off of what the prior evidence is, right? And it's not always intuitive to fill in all the gaps or recognize where those gaps are. You're just like, okay, you take a few pieces of information and you build off of that. And if you haven't realized that, like, oh, this information exists and there's something to it, but there's still a whole bunch of missing pieces to the puzzle. So I'm probably like prematurely kind of building on a foundation that really isn't there. So when it comes to like modeling the shoulder and stuff like that, like whether it's the physical models that people have built in research, which is like they'll take a severed arm and they'll like pin it to a little thing that rotates it, and then they'll try and figure out like internal moment arms by tying strings to it, which is not really much different than us attaching elastic bands to a skeleton, right? I mean, it's literally almost the exact same thing. And then you have the computer models where you're trying to create a simulation, and then you also have like, okay, now in some instances you can get some radiology or some motion based MRI imaging where you can kind of like see things changing and try and look at the stuff in real life. And there's just so many limitations to like, what do we have, so like a lot of the models for the shoulder only give you like certain degrees of freedom, like, oh, okay, well in this one I can flex and abduct the glenohumeral joint as much as I want, but I don't have any, scapulothoracic motion. And then you'll have another one where it's like, okay, I got this scapulothoracic motion or whatever, but it will only let me do certain things at the glenohumeral joint or whatever, right? Or it won't do them simultaneously, et cetera. So the modeling becomes extremely complex. And so that's kind of been what we've looked like kind of how we've changed is like, okay, once we were able to kind of fill in some of those gaps, right, all of a sudden it's like, man, the change in muscle length here with the scapulothoracic joint is significantly greater than that at the glenohumeral joint, and we just kind of often consider that. And then also then the specificity that we get, right, and then the impact that the trunk motion and stuff can have on there. So I think that's a specific example of something that that you can clearly obviously see in our content is like, all right, our approach to lats has kind of geared more towards prioritizing the scapular thoracic. Now that doesn't mean that like you're just isolating, you're just doing like the the depression or the retraction things in
Just the
isolation.
length and range partial of the depression.
You could do it for partials, right? But I don't think like you should do the depression all at once and then try and isolate the glenohumeral. Like if you're going to do a pull down, you should still have them kind of be within a rhythm with each other, not isolated from each other. But if we're in the extreme lengthened range, then you could isolate the scapular thoracic motion, especially at the end of a set for like lengthened partials and stuff, like that. And also then just being able to change your setup to work at a longer muscle length. But I'm not going out and saying like, hey, if you do these, you're going to get 10x the hypertrophy, because I don't know, right? Like, because maybe just, maybe just jumping on a prime machine that you can challenge the lengthened position is enough. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need the last 20, 30, 40, like maybe it's long as it's like, hey, it's somewhere on the lengthened half where it's hard. Maybe that's all that. Maybe that's enough. Don't know enough yet, right? So, but if you want to try and go to the full stretch, that's the wonderful thing about what we teach is we teach the full spectrum. So regardless of where you want to take it, if you want to do a program that's all short muscle lengths, you can apply what you learned at M1. If you want to do all lengthen, you can do that. Like if you want to do full range challenges, you can do that. Like, so it gives you, regardless of where the evidence takes us, it's going to give you the tools to get there. And so I am very happy that the way that we teach has somewhat kind of future proofed any changes that we have in this long versus short muscle length, et cetera. And I still believe that, both, like probably the best recipe is still a bit of both, and just kind of biasing more of your volume towards one or the other, depending on your goal, and then applying an individual approach to each exercise and, what you want out of it.
Mm. And I can certainly say from obviously doing a bunch of your courses it is sound principles over sound bites. And I always enjoy these conversations that I have with you and watching your content, because I see an evolution of Kass, probably more than I see through anyone else in the fitness space. Like the information, it's always kept the same overarching foundations, but you mentioned realizing how much biases you had. I think you're doing yourself a disservice in the fact that I think you have less biases than most of the industry. Like I see you develop and change and are happy to go, do you know what? I'm going to lean more into this than I thought a year ago. And you can see that in your content for however many years I've been following you. So for people that want to get that experience, which I wholeheartedly will say that, within the 4 to 5 mentors that I think have had the biggest impact in my career, you are 100% one of them. So I think that more people should go and follow your stuff and follow your courses. So where are people finding N1 if they're not following you already?
Yeah, so I mean, Instagram's the platform that we have the largest base, but 2024 is, I think, going to be the year that we're really going to break out. So we're going to be doing much more on YouTube, and who knows, maybe we'll start using TikTok again if I can just find a way to not actually be on the app myself. So
Filipino VA, and I'll sort that for you.
Yeah.
You just create the content.
Yeah, but honestly, like once you kind of see the content, if it's something you like, nothing can compete with actually learning this stuff hands on. And I think that's a message that people like. As somebody that's been through a gazillion courses, and yourself as well, like no matter how good we get with technology, like exercise is a physical thing, and it's a hands-on thing. And actually getting into a situation where you have to, position people or figure out the setup yourself and then apply the effort, right? Because it's one thing to talk about physics. It's another thing to live it, right? Yes. When you're tired, and et cetera, you're trying to push to failure, that's a very, very different experience. And so that's what I would try and encourage people the most is like, hey, if you think what you find online is valuable, what you'll find in person is exponentially like career changing.
So as regards to Instagram handles, we're following you at
n1.education or coach_Kassem.
Cool. And your courses are run primarily at your unbelievable little training lab that you've got in...
It's in Colorado, just outside of Boulder. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Mate, been an absolute pleasure. I'm saving the pennies away with the new business to come over to Colorado. I will definitely do that at some point, but it's always a pleasure, man. Thank you very much.
You too. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Made Podcast. If you're like me and like binge watching podcast episodes, click here to watch our latest episode. Or if you want to stay in touch and find out when the next episode goes live, click here to subscribe to the channel.